So today's the Thanksgiving holiday here in the US, and so I think it's appropriate to start out by expressing my gratitude to Yanis and all the colleagues at DiLCo for this kind invitation and inviting me to share my work today, which I consider still very much in progress. So let's get started. Chances are that over the last few years, you've found yourself encountering many texts that look something like these. These feedback solicitations from businesses can take many forms. Some are digital and some are non-digital. Some of the digital ones appear in our email inboxes, often as personalized messages designed to look as though they were sent uniquely to us, while others may arrive to us in the form of an SMS or text message, and still others have been integrated into some type of software that we're interacting with. And these have been pre-programmed to appear suddenly on our screens, usually as we're involved in some other task. So these tend to look a little bit more impersonal. Texts asking for our feedback as consumers can also appear in a range of material formats, from public signs to sales receipts and other kinds of artifacts. Some of these, like the machines that we often encounter in airports, ask us for an immediate physical interaction, while other non-digital requests for feedback exemplify the online-offline nexus, existing materially in the physical world as part of our linguistic and semiotic landscapes, yet prompting or directing users to communicate in some digital space, either via a link or a QR code like we're seeing here. So all of these kinds of feedback solicitations are the focus of my talk today. And what all of these texts share is a common function, which is requesting a response of some type from an individual consumer. In other words, these texts are asking us to engage in a prosuming activity. And prosuming or prosumption has varied and multiple definitions, but the one I'm using today follows Ritzer and Jurgensen and refers to getting customers to invest more effort and time themselves in order to increase efficiency, and I would add profit, for businesses. So in a nutshell, prosuming is the result of businesses putting consumers to work for them, and typically for no compensation. As we'll see shortly, although all of these texts are trying to get a consumer to respond to some type of prompt, the type of response that they're after, as well as how they go about asking for it, can vary considerably. Because of this variation, these texts are perhaps best conceptualized as kind of a genre family of related text types. And in the last year or so, I've collected and studied over 300 examples of these feedback solicitations. So one of the things that I found is that the type of response being requested usually falls into one of the following categories. So there can be requests for general open-ended feedback. There are also requests for a binary response reflecting a consumer's overall level of satisfaction with a product or service. So as you see here, thumbs up, thumbs down, good or bad, and so forth. There are also many requests for the rating of a consumer experience or service on a 3, 4, 5, 7, 10, or 11-point scale. There are also requests for taking brief surveys. And in my data, I found that a brief survey can mean anything from answering one question to around 10 minutes of survey engagement. And of course, there are also requests for consumer reviews of a product or business. And any of these can be combined variously in different ways. So in these particular examples, we see that linguistically, there are two main syntactic forms being used in making these requests, which are either direct questions or imperatives. Review us or send us feedback. Sometimes they're mitigated, sometimes they're unmitigated, but in other texts that we'll be seeing, there's a broader range of syntactic formula that are being used to realize the request. So at this point, you probably recognize this phenomenon that I've been talking about for the last 5 minutes, although you may not have given these small texts very much thought before. In fact, if you're like most people, you may have even deliberately ignored them or just quickly deleted them, like this example that I saw on a recent flight. So in the middle of our in-flight entertainment program, maybe an hour or so in the air, the programming was suddenly paused and this message appeared on everyone's screen. And as I looked around me, I saw that all of my fellow passengers just quickly X'd out of the screen and returned to their movies. And they did this so quickly that they likely didn't even notice the cute wordplay that was embedded in this request. Your feedback would be just plain awesome, plain spelled P-L-A-N-E, right? So it's likely that discourse strategies such as these are intended to capture the attention of the recipients of such messages. However, it's equally likely that most of us have reached a state of feedback solicitation saturation or fatigue as a result of encountering so many of these texts. And it's hard to know when exactly this phenomenon became as widespread as it currently is, but it seems to me that it's grown exponentially in about the last 5 or 7 years. On the production side of these texts in the world of marketing, these types of communications comprise a domain of activity that goes by various names. These include brand engagement, customer experience or CX, customer experience management, customer relations management, voice of customer, proactive service recovery, and I'm sure many more that I haven't even encountered yet. According to an article in the Journal of Marketing Research, in 2017, the solicitation of consumer feedback represented a $750 million industry, and it's likely that this has only continued to grow in size and value since that article has been published. And although there's an entire industry dedicated to it, I found that there's surprisingly little empirical research on this genre family of feedback solicitation from any discipline and not much from language studies. However, these texts all clearly comprise a pervasive form of contemporary business communication that is intended to achieve some effect. It's likely that some of these texts may have been written by UX writers, a topic that discourse scholar Laura Portman has been carrying out really interesting research on recently. And even though it's a different kind of text type that I'm looking at, Portman's work on cookie consent notices, particularly an article that she published in Discourse, Context, and Media a couple years ago, has really inspired some of my thinking about my own data. So for the rest of this presentation, my focus will be on some of the recurring, as well as some of the more unusual discourse strategies used by businesses to persuade consumers to respond to these types of requests. As we'll see, these strategies encompass the linguistic, the rhetorical, and the multimodal. My overarching question in this inquiry is, what discursive strategies are businesses adopting in formulating their big ask? In other words, what means are they using to try to get consumers to engage in free labor and provide them with various types of information that's relevant to and also consequential for their businesses? And then toward the end, I'll also be discussing a couple of cases that go beyond merely persuasion and even include tactics for priming particular kinds of desired responses. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about my methods, as well as how I got interested in this topic in the first place. So I've been studying online review language for about 15 years now, and I've noticed an increasing commodification of reviews and reviewing as entire industries have emerged, which are responsible for managing online consumer feedback. Because of this interest, some of my family and friends occasionally send me texts that they think I might find interesting. So last summer, one of my friends sent me this text, an email that he had received from a local business that was now asking him to write a review. And like most feedback solicitation emails, we see that it looks just like a slightly more casual business letter. It starts off with a greeting, closes with a thanking and a group signature. But the really interesting part here happens in the body of the message. So it starts with a request for a review, but then it continues, saying that if the customer had a negative experience, to instead contact the business directly. So this message is effectively routing consumers to two different channels. The public channel is reserved for reviews of the business, which of course the business is hoping is going to be positive, but the business also offers a private mode for communicating if in fact the customer had a disappointing experience. In this way, the business is preemptively attempting to manage their online reputation by reducing the potential for any negative reviews to be posted about them online. So it was really this one message that made me start paying closer attention, not only to the requests for reviews that I received, but requests for any kind of feedback sent to me by businesses. And requests, I should add, that I had been very successfully ignoring up until this point. However, as I started collecting data myself, after the first few weeks, I became aware about some of the peculiarities in my own patterns of consumption. And so this prompted me to consider crowdsourcing more diverse data from people who I know. So after I explained my research interest to them, I invited about 20 friends, family members, colleagues, and former students to share with me any feedback solicitation texts that they encountered. And so these individuals, who I call my data donors, represent a span of ages from about 20 to 80. They also represent different ethnicities, different professions, different levels of education and income, and they were also distributed throughout different parts of the US. Perhaps most importantly, as consumers, they definitely represented patterns of consumption that were very different from my own. So with their assistance, after 6 months, I collected just over 300 English language texts. And I say English language texts because those are the ones that I happen to be working with. But of course, these feedback solicitations happen in many other languages as well. So back to my 20 data donors. Now there's some pretty obvious pros and cons to this manner of collecting data. On the one hand, this resulted in a very unstructured and uncontrolled data set. And of course, some data donors were much more enthusiastic and consistent than others, while some sent me only a few texts and then probably got busy with other things in life, which is understandable. On the other hand, though, it did serve its purpose of allowing me to collect much more varied data and from a much broader range of business types than if I had relied solely on texts that my own household was exposed to. So I want to pause here for a second, give them all a quick acknowledgement for helping make this study possible. And so after 6 months of data collection, this is what my data look like by text type or format. And you can see here that by far the most common type, so 2/3 of the data, are email messages. And I had originally thought that this may be a function of how my data donors submitted their examples. Emails were, of course, the easiest to submit. They could just forward them to me without any further steps or mediation on their part. However, it's also the case that despite the growing importance of different social media platforms and customer service interactions, according to a recent industry report, email still remains the most important digital channel that businesses use to communicate with customers. So because the emails are so abundant in my data set, as well as they also tend to be the longest and the most linguistically varied. So we'll be looking at several examples from email messages. And thanks to my data donors, my data set includes communications from basically every sector, both for-profit and non-for-profit, everything from retail to healthcare, education to financial institutions, travel, tourism, hospitality, and so on. And it's worth mentioning here that from the entire universe of possible feedback solicitation texts, it's impossible to really know how representative any one particular data set like this one actually is. But after studying a few hundred of them, it's certainly possible to get a solid sense of what kinds of features are more typical and which ones are less typical. So as I initially screened my data, one of my unexpected and interesting discoveries was just how many third-party marketing companies were responsible for producing and or distributing these texts. And these were only the ones who had made themselves visible in their messages. And this was usually in the very fine print at the very bottom of the message. So I was curious to interview representatives from these companies in order to learn more about who was responsible for crafting these texts and how they went about doing their work. So as I mentioned before, I imagine that many of the authors were UX writers or designers in some cases, but I was curious to gain insight into how choices about specific language and modal features were being made behind the scenes. However, after several attempts on my part to contact all 27 third-party companies in this data set, only one agreed to talk to me. So I conducted that one interview with one market researcher. And in addition to that, I also carried out an interview with a marketing director at a local business who regularly sends me feedback solicitation messages. Obviously, it would have been great to have had many more interviews, but even the two that I conducted provided me with some important insights that I'll also be sharing. And I collected comments from my data donors, which I did not solicit, but which sometimes accompanied their messages to me. As I discuss individual examples, I'll touch on some of the relevant data gathered from these secondary or additional sources, and I have received my data donors' permission to include these texts as well. Okay, so let's start off by looking at some of the persuasion strategies. So judging from this particular data donor's comment to me that accompanied their submission of this email from Venmo. Venmo is a US-based mobile payment app. It seems that offering some type of financial incentive, like a chance to win a gift card worth $1,000 in exchange for feedback, could be a very effective persuasion strategy. But this actually turned out to be very uncommon. In fact, this is just a handful of such examples from my data. And I learned about why that is from the interview that I conducted with that market researcher who I mentioned just a moment ago. And he said that offering financial incentives has become really challenging in the last 15 to 20 years because of questionable tactics that were previously used by the pharmaceutical and gaming industries. This has led to much tighter regulations and many legal barriers to offering financial incentives or any form of compensation like this to consumers in these kinds of solicitation messages, at least as far as the US is concerned. I'm not sure how this works in other contexts. But one way to circumvent some of these regulations may be offering to donate money to some third party instead of compensating the consumer directly. And we see this strategy being applied in an example in a feedback request from a publishing company targeting educators. So basically, this company is offering to make a charitable donation to one of two causes up to a certain threshold of surveys completed. In this case, there are a couple of interesting presuppositions on the part of the business that's making this offer. So number one, they're assuming that these two causes are things that most educators will care about. And number two, they're also assuming that their recipient is the type of person who might appreciate exercising their agency by deciding where a donation made on their behalf should go. As I said, these kinds of financial incentives are pretty rare. However, when they do occur, the incentives offered are typically for relatively small amounts. And we see that on these two sales receipt examples. These are really common in the US, by the way. So you get a sales receipt after you make your payment. And then at the bottom, there's an opportunity to give feedback in some form. So in the example on the left, we see a bookstore offering $5 off on the consumer's next purchase of $40 or more. And then this is after they've completed the survey and received a validation code. The same process works with the receipt on the right, which is from a fast food chain to buy one hamburger and get the other one free, also after completing the survey. So in fact, both of these financial incentives entail having to make a repeat purchase. So here with these two examples, we see the close integration of customer satisfaction activities with what is also clearly a marketing strategy intended to result in repeat business and future purchases from existing customers. By motivating customers to provide feedback in this way, it's, as I said, it's pretty rare. So instead, what's far more common and actually extremely pervasive in these data is an attempt by the business to establish discursively some type of relational connection with the consumer. And the word love actually appears in over 30% of the email messages, for instance, most often, as we see here, in these conventional request formulae, like we'd love to know what you'd think, or we'd love to hear from you, or we'd love your feedback, and so on. So these are very commonly occurring collocations in the data. Some businesses really emphasize the affective dimension of the business-consumer relationship, and they do this in multiple ways using multiple semiotic resources. So here's a feedback solicitation email from Southwest Airlines, and the business's striped heart logo at the top is supposed to convey this notion that they're the airline with, quote, heart and hospitality. And this particular airline brand, for anyone who's not familiar with it, is also known in the US for its informality. Both the informality and the affective relationship emphasized by this brand are constructed here in a couple of different ways. So the word love appears twice. First, in that conventional request formula at the beginning of the message of "we'd love to get your feedback," as well as in the final and far more unusual complimentary close "love" that precedes the business's group signature. Furthermore, as you can see, both instances also feature this unconventional spelling of love, which is highly informal, and which also appears in all caps both times, drawing even more attention to this highly marked feature. And we see another attempt at establishing a relational connection happening in the group signature, where we see the business positioning themselves as friends of the consumer. Before I turn to some other ways in which businesses position themselves and consumers in their attempts at being persuasive, it's worth very briefly to point out the way in which this feedback is being solicited here. So you can see as the entry point into the survey, the customer is first being asked to rate on a 10-point scale how likely they are to recommend this business to friends, family, or colleagues. This type of prompt and rating scale appear in about 10% of the email data. And in fact, this kind of 10, or sometimes it appears as an 11-point scale, is used to calculate a very specific metric called the NPS, or Net Promoter Score. And I'll return to the NPS later toward the end of my presentation. But for now, let's take a look at some of the other ways in which businesses position consumers in their messaging in order to establish this relational connection. So it's not unusual to see businesses positioning consumers as family members, or sometimes as friends, like we just saw with that Southwest example, or intimates and confidants who the business is wanting to listen to, or as members of a community of fellow consumers. And still, other businesses position consumers as their teammates or their colleagues or their collaborators. And we'll see a specific instance in this next case here. This is a shoe company. And the strategy here starts with a subject line. Want to help design our next shoe? And you see this elliptical question form. It continues with an appeal, offering the consumer a sneak preview of new products being launched. Once again, we also see the word love occurring repeatedly in a couple of different linguistic contexts. Again, in the request formula, we'd love to get your input and feedback. And so overall, these multiple discourse strategies contribute to creating a highly consumer-centric text that's designed to construct and emphasize the consumer's investment in the company. And although the consumer's compliance with taking the survey is framed as benefiting the consumer, at the same time, getting an existing customer's perspective before actually launching any new products can obviously benefit the company in helping determine what styles or product features they'll be more likely to sell in the future. So in terms of prosuming, scholars like Zwick et al. Have pointed out that the ideological recruitment of consumers into productive co-creation relationships hinges on accommodating consumers' need for recognition, freedom, and agency. And this shoe company seems to be using the consumer's need for recognition and agency as a guiding principle in their messaging as they solicit their existing customers' feedback specifically about potential new products. We can contrast this highly consumer-centric approach used by the shoe company with another example. So here's an email solicitation message from Mutual of Omaha, which is an insurance company. And in this feedback solicitation, there's absolutely no attempt on their part to frame the consumer's participation in their rather long 15-minute survey as benefiting the customer in any way. In this respect, it's perhaps one of the most direct, straightforward, and business-centric requests, as it directs consumers to help us do market research in a very unmitigated way, as we see here. There's also no incentive, motivation, or compensation, whether material or symbolic, being offered to the consumer. And instead of appealing to any kind of close relational connection beyond just valued customer, what is in fact a request for consumer data is here being reframed as an invitation. And that invitation is further upgraded or boosted as a kind of limited time offer. So we often see the principle of scarcity appearing here in the text. A survey will be closing soon, don't miss out. We see similar tactics of limited time opportunities being applied as an effective tactic in sales context typically, but interestingly, the same strategy is being repurposed here for motivating a response for a feedback solicitation. In other words, the main motivation is if you don't participate soon, you'll miss out on this invitation, which of course it's not an invitation, it's a request. It's possible that the construction of this particular text may have been informed by principles of marketing psychology. In fact, in Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, which is a classic marketing psychology text, scarcity is discussed as one of 7 persuasive tactics that are effective in sales contexts. So this particular title, Cialdini's Influence, was mentioned as being an influential text during my interview with a market researcher that I mentioned earlier. He wasn't responsible for this particular text, by the way. I've also observed that images and mentions of other books written by Cialdini have appeared in social media posts of one of the largest third-party customer experience companies represented in my data set. But beyond all of that, you may have also noticed that this example is a bit atypical in its overall communicative style, in that it's much more formal than some of the other texts that we've looked at. Other examples we've seen, like say the Southwest Airlines email, have been much more conversational in tone. And who knows, perhaps this is because we prefer for our insurance companies to sound more formal and serious rather than too friendly or overly casual. However, the far more common informal or conversational style of discourse that's much more typical of texts like these is what scholars working from a critical discourse studies perspective following Fairclough would call synthetic personalization, which refers to this informal kind of pseudo-intimate tone adopted by entities like businesses or organizations in order to simulate a one-on-one mode of communication. From a different scholarly tradition, that is business communication, the very same kinds of features that we might associate with synthetic personalization are subsumed under a different construct called CHV, or conversational human voice. And although CHV has been around for over a decade, a few years ago it was usefully operationalized by a couple of Dutch business communication scholars, Christine Liebrecht and Charlotte van Hooijdonk, as comprising 17 different discourse features that fall into 3 main categories. So the first of these categories is labeled message personalization, and this includes, not exclusively, but primarily discrete linguistic features, such as first and second person pronouns, addressing the consumer by name, for example, in greetings, and using the name of the individual or group responsible for the communication, often in closings. We saw several of these features in some of the more informal examples that we looked at. And I should add that these also include different visual forms of personalization, for instance, like including a photo of the employee. The next category of CHV is called informal speech, and it includes informal lexis as well as informal syntax, like contractions and ellipsis, which are typically associated with more casual spoken registers. But this also includes other semiotic resources such as all caps, creative respellings, and emoji. And then finally, the third category is called invitational rhetoric. And this refers generally to, I would say, discourse level phenomena, like it encompasses language functions or speech acts, features such as thanking, apologizing, well-wishing, expressing empathy, and so on. So I'd like to quickly illustrate how these various features of CHV can work together in a single feedback solicitation text. This is a request for feedback from an e-retailer that sells greeting cards. And I've noticed in analyzing hundreds of these texts, it's often most interesting to look at what small businesses do, because it seems that small businesses are less constrained by rules, conventions, and perhaps also the legal departments that govern larger corporate communication. This is an especially interesting case since a greeting card company is the kind of business that is likely aware of the impact that specific linguistic choices can have on readers. So in terms of the first CHV category, message personalization, this feedback solicitation text includes greeting the customer by name, using first and second pronouns, and very often these first and second person pronouns occur together within the same syntactic construction, serving to link the business and the consumer in some type of relational connection. In this case, that connection appears in the form of "we want to help you." In terms of the second category of conversational human voice, informality features, we see a couple of instances of all caps, as well as informal syntax, contraction, and abbreviation here in the hugs and kisses, which also appear in all caps. And finally, for the third category of CHV, which is invitational rhetoric, the text includes thanking, as well as stimulating dialogue and showing empathy. The showing empathy move is perhaps the most interesting and unusual one here because it includes two metapragmatic commentaries about the very genre that the text itself represents. So in "We know you get a million of these," the deictic in "a million of these" refers to the recent rapid profusion of the genre that I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk. And this comment is immediately followed by "we hate these things too," a second metapragmatic statement, which presents a perhaps unexpectedly negative stance. But what the business accomplishes with this instance of negative stance taking toward these things is an important shift in perspective. So instead of continuing to write from the perspective of the business, at this point, they momentarily align with the message recipient as fellow consumers, and more specifically as fellow consumers who are also annoyed about or tired of receiving exactly these kinds of communications. Of course, as a result of this unusual act of stance taking, they must now make a compelling case for why the recipient, who they've positioned as also hating these things, should make an exception for this particular business and comply with their request for feedback. They do this by moving beyond the CHV features that I've just pointed out and accomplish other things as well at the levels of both language and rhetoric. So at the very top, as the first move in the text, we get kind of a summarized version of the company's ethos, basically a condensed sort of mission statement. And this is further underscored throughout the text by several repetitions of this important word connection. So this is the word that this particular business relies on to create a relationship with their customers. And while this example, I'd say, is atypical in just how many diverse CHV strategies that it's using to appeal to the consumer, other strategies that they use are actually very common and occur across a wider range of solicitation texts. So one of these is providing some kind of explanation of who benefits from the prosuming activity, as well as potentially how. The benefits of giving feedback are formulated here as helping the business succeed, as well as the more vaguely formulated, helping the business make things more personal. In addition, other consumers are mentioned as indirectly benefiting since the business claims to use feedback to educate other consumers about their products. And finally, it's claimed that feedback helps the business decide which products to carry. And so this is a similar type of appeal to what we saw earlier with the help us design our next shoe example. Another very common strategy we see exemplified here is minimizing or downgrading the time involved on the part of the consumer to engage in the requested prosuming activity. We see that the time and position is sort of doubly downgraded here with the request to give the business a quick minute. So time minimizers are one of the features that is extremely common in these types of communications, occurring in the majority of email messages and nearly always when survey engagement is being requested. It's also not rare to find repeated or multiple forms of time minimizers appearing close together in the very same text as in the underlined examples here. We can consider the downgrading of the time commitment required in complying with the request as a recognition on the part of the business of the imposition of their request and showing their awareness that the addressee's compliance involves some investment of their time. When businesses ask consumers to engage in prosuming activities, they're not only expecting them to take up these specific relational positionings, as we've seen, but of course, they're expecting consumers to engage in uncompensated labor that in some way adds value to their business. So far, we've taken a look at what we might consider more general persuasive strategies in these communications to get consumers to comply with businesses' requests for feedback. These have ranged from using discourse to establish a close personal relationship with a consumer to explaining who benefits from such feedback and how. I'd like to now turn to the second part of this presentation and take a look at some of the subtle and not so subtle tactics that businesses use to prime a specific kind of desired response. So this often happens with solicitations of reviews. When a business solicits a review and a rating, it's possible to do so in a very neutral way, like we see here. However, some businesses instead opt to use one of these pre-filled forms where the star rating is preset to 5 stars as the default choice. In my data, these kinds of pre-filled forms seem to be used most often by e-retailers. And as we can see in these examples, visually, the preferred response has not only been provided as filled in by the company, but it's also the placement of that preferred response that's in the most visually salient position. So it's at the top as the first element in a vertical list or as the first response on the left side when it appears as part of a horizontal list. As I've mentioned, this type of visual priming is most common in requests for reviews, but we also see it occasionally in requests for other types of feedback. So this is a web pop-up feedback solicitation that appeared as I was using a manuscript solicitation software from an academic publisher. And I can assure you that 5easy was not my selection, but instead, this is how it first appeared on my screen without any interaction or intervention from me. So again, you can see that the preferred response is made more visually salient here by being darker than the other options. It's subtle, but we can consider this an exploitation of modal resources in order to prime a desired response. Another tactic that's sometimes used to prime a desired response is to show that lots of other consumers have given positive feedback. So the example on the left is an email from a restaurant, and it's a little small there, but at the top it says 160 reviews, and it shows an average rating of 4.9 out of 5 stars. And the one on the right is a web pop-up from a tech company, which shows not only how many others responded to this feedback solicitation prompt, but also that the obvious majority responded positively. Both of these are another page out of marketing psychologist Robert Cialdini's playbook. According to Cialdini's 7 Tactics of Persuasion, the principle of social proof posits that people are more likely to comply when they see that others have. And in both cases, not only are many other consumers shown to have complied with the request, but the clear majority are shown as being very obviously satisfied. So this next tactic comes with a very specific type of indirect compensation, and this one comes with a brief narrative of from my own personal experience. So last year, we had an electrician come out to work on our house, and at the end of her visit, when my husband and I thanked her for doing a great job, she encouraged us to write an online review, and she added that she gets a cash bonus each time she's mentioned in a 5-star review on Google. Within 48 hours of her visit, we received not one, but 2 feedback solicitation messages in 2 different formats. The first on the left by text message and the other by email on the right. And both included not only our electrician's name, but also her photo. So again, these personalization strategies being applied, both verbal and visual. And you can also see in the fine print in these messages that this was not being sent by the electrical company, but it was being instead being sent by one of those 27 third-party feedback solicitation businesses that I mentioned earlier. So in this case, the priming of the 5-star review is not part of the text itself, but it happens earlier in the face-to-face interaction. This is another example of the online-offline nexus happening as part of the service encounter. I happened to mention this phenomenon in a conversation that I had with the graduate student in marketing at my university, and she informed me that there are lots of other businesses in our area that engage in similar tactics. So according to her, one of our local car washing businesses has a no tipping policy, and instead of accepting tips, their employees hand customers a card with their name on it, and they tell them that for every 5-star Google review that mentions them by name, they will receive a $5 bonus from their employer. I was curious, so I checked, and nearly every review for that business that I saw mentioned a specific employee by name and appeared with a rating of 5 stars. So this seems like a win-win-win situation for priming a specific type of positive feedback. The review is based on an actual visit, so there's no opinion fraud happening. The employee gets a bonus. The consumer can feel good about themselves for helping the employee get a bonus, and the bonus comes out of the business's pocket. So the real winner here is the business, though, that not only gains more reviews, but also gains more 5-star reviews, boosting their overall rating this way. And of course, we know that higher star ratings on Google positively correlate with businesses' incomes. So I looked into it further and checked out Google's policies about incentivizing or rewarding reviews directly. In these cases, as I mentioned, the reviews are based on genuine experiences. However, they are being incentivized, albeit indirectly. And it also appears that the businesses are selectively soliciting only positive reviews. So at best, we can say that this type of priming of a positive review is perhaps a gray area and maybe an ethically questionable practice. But it's one that we've seen and I've now experienced several times since I started the project. This is a practice that some businesses engage in. A few minutes ago, we saw how some businesses go about making their desired responses visually salient, for instance, by autofilling the most positive response and having that set as the default for reviews and ratings. But I'd now like to end with a final example that will hopefully wrap things up and answer the larger question of why and in what specific ways these texts are potentially consequential. So you'll remember that I mentioned earlier that this 11-point rating scale is used to calculate something called the Net Promoter Score. And I'll ask you here on this slide to ignore all of the language in this and instead focus specifically on how this 11-point rating scale is being presented visually. So here on the left is a typical 11-point scale presented neutrally. But in the example on the right, you can see that certain segments of the scale are highlighted with specific colors. The positive end of the scale is in green, and the much larger negative end is in red, and then in between is in yellow. I don't know if we can consider this priming in quite the same way as in some of the other examples, but we can say that these colors are certainly semiotically meaningful and that they're signaling certain types of values. So maybe we can consider this a more implicit or subliminal type of priming. Now, it's pretty obvious why a business would want to prime a positive review or a positive rating that are going to be posted publicly for other consumers to view. But if a business is soliciting our honest feedback and truly wants to know what we think about our experience via a rating scale that's part of a larger satisfaction survey, likely to be used internally, why then are we being guided visually to interpret this rating scale as strongly positively skewed? At this point, the interview I conducted with a business representative offers some useful insights. So first, a brief explanation of how the Net Promoter Score works. First, any consumer who rates the business in the range of 0 or 1 to a 6 is considered a detractor. while those who rate it a 9 or a 10 are considered promoters. And in the middle are the passives, the ones in yellow who assign a rating of 7 or 8. So this allows the business to do at least two things. The first is to classify their customers into these particular categories. And for instance, to run queries on how particular groups of customers behave. In other words, they can take this measure and combine it with other consumer behavior analytics that they have collected in order to run focused marketing campaigns or to do predictive modeling and so forth. The second is to compute the business's actual net promoter score. And you can see the mathematical formula for that here in the bottom of the graphic. So a business's net promoter score is the percentage of detractors subtracted from the percentage of promoters. The resulting number is then used for benchmarking. So the business can compare themselves with others in the same industry, and then go on to make claims such as, we have the highest levels of customer satisfaction in the industry for the last 2 years. All of this to say that for consumers who do respond to these requests and who do provide businesses with feedback, businesses may be doing a lot more with that data than just using it to, quote, keep providing you with exceptional service. Such feedback makes it not only easier for businesses to market to us, but we're also adding value to that business in ways that are likely not completely transparent to many of us. Okay, so to wrap things up, what are some of the common persuasive strategies businesses use in formulating their big ask? In general, businesses tend to rely on a largely informal register associated with either synthetic personalization or conversational human voice, depending on your perspective. Importantly, this register helps to create a kind of interpersonal closeness. This is often further enhanced by the use of affective language that discursively constructs a relational connection between the business and the consumer. And we saw that it's not only language, it's also through visual sometimes. We've seen that because there are practical constraints on financial compensation, rewards offered for complying with such requests tend to be more symbolic rather than material. In some cases, consumers are given the idea that by complying with these requests through their prosuming activities, they're exercising their agency in ways that matter. For instance, by helping to select which shoe styles will get made in the next season, or by helping an employee of a business get a small financial bonus. Various forms of symbolic compensation also fit with the logics of late capitalism, where many people feel that they do have a relationship with a brand in defining themselves by their consumer affiliations and saying things I've heard people say many times, like, we are a Toyota family, or I am a Mac person. Nevertheless, businesses are aware that their requests are a big ask, and for this reason, many of them try to downgrade their request by using time minimizers, and this was one of the more pervasive features that we saw in the data. Finally, beyond persuading consumers to respond to requests for feedback, we also saw a range of tactics that businesses engaged in with the goal of guiding, steering, or priming users into giving them a positive response or rating, the accumulation of which, as we saw, has the potential of adding value to the company. So on that note, I'll close by thanking you for your attention, and of course, by inviting you to give your feedback in the remaining time that we have left.
Thank you so much, Camilla, for this. I'm changing the optics for you to see the little clapping hands. Thank you so much. We have some time for discussion, like 12 or 13 minutes. Please raise up your little yellow hands to ask a question, or type your question into the chat and we'll read it off there. Okay, I don't see any questions yet. Maybe I have Benjamin on the line. Please go on.
Great, thanks.
Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, and you can switch on your camera if you wish.
I wish not to, just because I don't look great right now. But thank you, Dr. Vasquez, for the excellent presentation. This question is a little bit, I guess it would be a little more speculative for you, but just based on what you saw and your interview with some of the ad people, do you think it seems like kind of the strategies for these companies are to be very kind of informal and create kind of an interpersonal closeness. But at the same time, it seems like, at least internally, it's kind of, they're moving to like very impersonal strategies for like categorizing these consumers, like you said, with kind of like on with the 0 out of 10, and then putting them in certain positions and then reaching them in according to their categorization. So I'm wondering if like those two, do you think are related, kind of in like an so like they realize they have a less personal relationship with their clients, so they feel like they have to to fake their closeness? Or do you think they're kind of imitating like small businesses, because it seems like small businesses do have more of an impersonal strategy? So sorry if I talked a lot.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? I think the challenge is that these are mass messaging, right? So they're being sent out to lots and lots of people, but they're trying to make it seem like I'm communicating directly to you. Yeah, and I don't know that I would say that the small businesses are doing something that's more formal. What they do is more unconventional often. So like, there's a certain like the "we love to," that seems like now very seems canned almost, because it occurs in so many of these messages, and small businesses will formulate things in a way that actually is a little bit more, that sounds a little bit more like spoken language, like, would you mind taking a few minutes, or something like that, like yeah, do you have some time to give us some answers, right? So it's kind of more I would say syntactically elaborate kinds of things, which I think we might do it more in interpersonal communication or in spoken communication. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yep, thank you.
Shenya, I think we have a question in the chat.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's a few compliments in the chat. Wonderful, so insightful. And then Luke Carey asks, do you think Google should be doing more to make sure incentives for reviews are not unethical?
yeah, and I think that there's a big question there, and I didn't say that they are. I said it's like a gray area. I don't know, because it's I think all marketers are now telling businesses like the Google ratings really matter, right? We know that for sure. I think, and Google's really coming down. I was reading a recent article in the New York Times about they're definitely cracking down on fake reviews a lot more. So this there are larger issues, I think, in terms of monitoring the platforms monitoring the veracity of reviews, where this kind of indirect compensation, it's probably not their number one priority. Should they be doing more if they have more resources, perhaps, but I think it's probably much harder.
Okay, let's take the question by Carrie. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, great. I loved your presentation. I had a question also, if you saw that assumptions was used a lot, kind of this alignment, or like, I know you need a car, or that kind of like also alignment, that strategy of also as a way to align like a business with their customer, as a way to help kind of prime their response as well. So the assumption.
Like the alignment, like I showed in the greeting card company, where they're assuming that that their customer has certain preferences or needs.
Yes, exactly. Did you kind of see that in certain, I don't know if you notice it in certain markets or not, like more so than in like maybe something in that you're trying to buy something? Or I'm just wondering if you notice certain strategies also in certain segments of the market.
I think in the automobile, like car dealers and car mechanics, I think the assumptions are often like, how important this is for our business, or how important this is for our employees. So I'm just trying to think, scanning all 300 of the messages mentally now to see whether that would be something interesting to I guess to look at systematically, is really like what is being presupposed, on what kinds of knowledge or needs are being presupposed by the business on the part of the consumer. So thanks for that question, Carrie. I will follow up.
Thanks.
Thank you, Carrie. Next up is Alfonso.
There's another message in the chat first.
Let's take the message in the chat and then we'll take Alfonso. Go on, Jenny.
Yeah, from Ali Syed. He says, thank you for such a phenomenal presentation. I have two questions. One, were people who created these feedback collecting messages aware of the priming strategies that you pointed out, or did they adopt such tactics randomly? And two, do you think that publishing such wonderful research would help make marketing companies use the strategies that you mentioned to their advantage to gain more stars?
Huh. So were the recipients of the I guess the first question is, were the recipients of the messages themselves aware of the priming?
I think it's the people who created them. The people who created the collected messages.
Oh, I'm quite sure that this is very intentional. Yeah. So for instance, the autofill, there are lots of companies sort of selling the autofill forms or teaching companies how to do this. So there's a market for yes, definitely. This is not unintentional. And so even the color coding that I showed with the NPS. So most of the instances of the NPS when it appears, the scale in my data is neutral. But I just had a colleague from Europe sent me several examples from a couple countries in Europe where it's starting to appear more and more. So I think that's interesting. To me, that's interesting in terms of how positive, like we've known that ratings and reviews are always positively skewed. There's always more 4 and 5 star reviews than there are 1 and 2 star, but now this is kind of like formalizing that skewed evaluation, right? So in fact, it's not really a 10-point scale if you think that all of this stuff in the red is negative, right? So yeah, I think they're doing it extremely with knowledge, deliberately, intentionally to achieve some effect. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the second part of the question now.
The second one was whether publishing your research would help make the marketing companies use them even more or use them to their advantage to gain more stars.
Yeah, so I think, again, I'm pretty sure that because I saw repeated kinds of tactics and things happening, I'm sure that marketers and these third-party companies are well aware of what some of these strategies are. I think in terms of linguistically, I don't know that they use a taxonomy, for instance, like the CHV, to kind of check, all the boxes and let's make sure we use as many of these as possible. Things like, I have a friend who's a copywriter in marketing, and so we're talking about this, and he says, oh yeah, well, for informality, if we're trying to adopt an informal tone, we always use contractions and we use them consistently, right? So there's certain kinds of things that copywriters and marketers are aware of. Other things might not be. I don't know. That's an interesting question. Another friend who works in the tech industry said, oh yeah, you could probably, create a taxonomy and then sell it to these businesses. That's not something I have in my immediate plans, but I suppose it could be doable. And then we would find out the answer to the question, how interested these folks would be in these results. So thank you for that question, those questions. Interesting.
Next up is Alfonso, if you're still there.
Yeah, I'm still here. Thank you. Let me just show my face. It's early here in the US, but yeah. Well, thank you, Camilla. It was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. And the question that came to my mind straight away, like knowing, just visiting Florida overall, you get like a very clear idea of Spanish and English really coexisting very well. So I was just wondering, how is that? Have you observed any kind of, or have you had the chance to look into Spanish data? Have you seen an influence of, Spanish discourse, like semantics, syntax, whatever, getting into requests for feedback in English? I'm not sure if you've had the chance, but just curious. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that question. That's phase 2. So okay. Yeah, I haven't started doing it systematically. I do have family living in in Latin America who send me examples too that I've been saving and collecting and storing, but I haven't looked at systematically. There's still a lot to do with the English language data kind of first to have a baseline. But in response to your question, so there are places specifically in South Florida, or even I was thinking in Puerto Rico, where there's a lot of parallel bilingualism. So you have, both languages appearing in orders depending on where you are, probably. And like even with the the data that I've collected, they're not all exclusively monolingual. So for instance, Toyota's emails come in 6 different languages. So the request is in English, and then in Spanish, and then I think Japanese, and I don't remember what the other languages are. So there's another company, I don't know if it's Hilton. And again, I don't know if it's because came from a particular region in the US, but it's always like English first and then French, or English then Spanish. So some of these feedback solicitations being sent here are bilingual. It's not a huge proportion, or multilingual. It's not a huge proportion of the text that I have, though. And it's like very specific companies, and it's larger corporations.
Interesting. All right. Thank you.
Yep. If you come across any cool looking, interesting text, feel free to send them my way.
Thank you, I will.
Yeah.
We'll take another voice question by Erin, and then we'll take the last one in the chat before we round up. Hi.
Hi, Camilla. Thanks for this. Nice to see you. Unfortunately, I was unable to join about halfway through, so forgive me if you kind of addressed my question earlier on. But I was wondering if you looked at this, and I don't know if this is a corpora kind of just for today or part of your larger set of data, but if you kind of looked at it through a platform specific perspective, notably if you saw any discourse markers or trends in these tactics that were aligned with the specific platform that was used to send them. So I know you have the text, you have multiple emails. I don't know if you have another kind of carrier or platform that was used to solicit the feedback, but I wondered if you saw any differences between how that was constructed based on the platform.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And yes, and I haven't done that systematically yet. That's also coming soon. So the emails are the longest and the most linguistically varied, and there's a lot of space to do things. And they're also kind of more modally varied as well. So some look very, just black letters on white background that look like a business letter or just a typical email, while some look like very much like ads, like there's a lot of graphics, and some even have animations embedded in them. So there's a range of what these things look like just in that format. Obviously, SMS or text messages are going to be really, really brief. So there's not as much space to do things in, not as much, not as many visuals. I'm trying to think. Yeah. And then the offline, I wish there was some way of kind of systematically gaining access to more of the offline text, because those are really kind of wildly varied and very interesting. And so yeah, I think that, but so I think one of the challenges, and again, this is part of the data collection and the methodology difficulties, is that I don't necessarily have access to the same proportions of texts in each mode, let's say, right? So the material ones are like, I have to go out in the world and find things and take pictures of them, or ask others to do that, which is harder to do, versus the emails, which just seem to be never ending and the richest sorts of data, because we all get so many of them. So yeah, I mean, in general, definitely I can see like, shorter or more some of the physical ones, for instance, in local businesses and smaller businesses, are also more varied visually, or they're trying to do multiple things, like give us feedback, but also follow us on Instagram and do this, right? So there's like, it becomes a very cluttered space, and it's not only doing one thing. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, thanks. And thanks again for the presentation. Lovely to hear from you.
Zhenya, over to you for the last question in the chat, and then we'll round it up.
Yeah, from Malika Ake. Dr. Vásquez, thank you very much for your amazing talk. Would you say these businesses draw on the social media discourse to use the shared dialect and to create a sense of recognition? If so, are they targeting a specific audience?
Oh, that's actually an interesting question that I didn't touch on. And by the way, I didn't plant Malika to ask that question, but so I noticed that the data donors that I have at the younger end of my spectrum, who would send me certain texts, first of all, businesses that were specific to that demographic. I noticed that there were a lot more informality features, lots of informality features in those particular messages. So I don't know if that's reflective of like social media communication broadly, or if that's like, if they're more demographic specific, like we know we're writing to a 20-year-old who buys these particular kinds of products, and so let's keep it very casual and informal. Although it wasn't there's not necessarily a that's not exclusive, I would say, to that demographically, because like the Southwest airline message, which I consider probably one of the more informal ones in terms of a lot of the features that it used, was sent to somebody who was not on the younger end of my demographic spectrum.
Thank you. We're already 4 minutes late, which is a testimony to how much interest your talk attracted, Camilla. Thank you again all so much. And meet us again in 2 weeks' time for the last DiLCo lecture for this year by Florian Busch from the University of Bern. Until then, farewell. See you soon.